I want to go ahead and get started and talk about dismissive remarks. And I'm really interested to hear how dismissive remarks have impacted your lives, how you may have found yourself being the one giving dismissive remarks, because we all do it. We've all done it at some point in time. And I want us to begin to be more mindful of these dismissive remarks that we make to people without even thinking about it, and talk about maybe a few examples of dismissive remarks, and then also how those dismissive remarks impact our relationships that we may have, but then also to follow up with that on what we can do to be more mindful about them and to try and avoid making those dismissive remarks to people that we encounter in our lives, especially the people that we say we love, that we're in long-term or intimate relationships. And this has an impact even on your professional relationships as well, when we make dismissive remarks to people. And we have to really be careful of that. And when you think about dismissive remarks, if you just break it down, you hear diss, and everyone has heard the idea of people being dissed. And if someone feels like they've been dissed, it has a tendency to lead them to want to retaliate. And we don't want to create those situations where people feel like they need to retaliate towards us about thoughts that we may have or circumstances that we may be dealing with. So we want to be mindful of those dismissive remarks and make sure we're very cognizant of that. But here are a few examples of dismissive remarks that are commonly made. And there's a lot of them. And understand that everyone may take them differently. Everyone may perceive them differently. And I want you to keep in mind that even though we know in our minds what we mean when we make certain comments, people have a tendency to interpret based on their experiences. They tend to interpret based on their perception of life, their perception of you. And you have to understand that your behaviors in the past will impact the way people perceive the things that you say. Some people have the ability to, and it's amazing to me how I see trainers sometimes, or some people, they have this lively, bubbly attitude, and they are very assertive. And if someone raises their hands a lot, they'll say, "Okay, there you go. It's you again. What do you want to say, John?" And they can get away with that because that's the personality that they have established, and people understand that they aren't trying to be offensive, that they aren't trying to criticize or put that person on the spot. And even if they are, it has become acceptable because of the pattern of behavior they've established. And that's how people understand them. But for someone that doesn't typically behave that way, if I were to say that, well, not because I think people will understand that I don't have bad intentions with anything that I say to them. But for someone that doesn't typically do that, that has a more serious personality, if they were to tell someone that, "Okay, here you go, it's you again, John, what do you want to say?" Then it might cause John to feel a little bit more withdrawn and not want to speak his mind because he feels like he's been isolated. It makes him feel like it's a dismissive remark because they don't necessarily want to hear what he has to say because he says too much. So we've got to think about that. Our behaviors over time affect the way people perceive the things that we say. But here are just a few dismissive remarks that are pretty common. "You're overreacting." Who wants to hear that? "You're overreacting." "I don't have time for this." "I already told you that." "It's not a big deal." "That's irrelevant." "You're being too sensitive." "I'm too busy to deal with this." Though, and that's just a few. And there's so many little remarks and phrases that people use that can be dismissive or perceived as dismissive. Because understand, even if your intent isn't to dismiss them, the perception based on the tone of how you say it, the scenario of when you say it, and the state of mind of the person hearing you say it has a tremendous impact on whether or not that's a dismissive remark. Because we can't decide for them if they feel dismissed in that moment, even though that isn't what we intended. So we have to make sure that we keep that in mind. And I want you to think about this as an example. When we hear dismissive remarks, because they have a cumulative effect on us. And when I say cumulative, there's the idea that something happens one time, it's okay. You deal with it, you get over it, and you move on. But if it happens again, then you pay a little bit more attention to it the second time, and you start to think just a little bit more. You notice it, it doesn't affect you a lot, but you think about it a little more. But a third time, it begins to resonate that much more, and you become more intentional. So imagine that you walk in the kitchen with someone and you have something that you want to share with them. And as you are about to share something that you feel is important, something that you feel is exciting, and they throw water in your face. The water is harmless. The water won't hurt you for most people. There may be some people with special conditions that water could be harmful, but for 99 point whatever percent of the population, water is harmless to them. But it's the scenario, it's the situation. In your mind, you have something that you were trying to accomplish, something you wanted to share that was either sensitive, important, or exciting to you. And as you're trying to share your thoughts, they throw water in your face. Now you wipe the water off and you may laugh about it the first time because it was harmless. And it's amazing how when we walk away from that situation where someone threw the water in your face and you go back and sit down and suddenly you feel a drop of water somewhere on your chin that you didn't get off the first time. So that little drop of water takes you back to the moment when they threw the all the water in your face, when they flicked the water in your face the first time. It that one little drop later on reminds you of the incident where you didn't get the opportunity to share what you wanted to share the way that you wanted to because they decided that what they wanted to do was more important than listen to what you had to say. Now, if you go back in the kitchen later on that day and you want to share something else, something else happened, you're excited again, and they decide to throw water in your face again. So now it becomes a little more uncomfortable. It isn't funny this time because now it begins to feel a little bit disrespectful. They're disregarding your feelings. They're disregarding just your space. Why are you throwing water in my face? I laughed about it the first time, but this time we need to stop doing that because now it isn't funny. I had something I wanted to share with you, something I'm trying to do. So think about that, how it progresses. The third time, now you're probably upset when they throw the water in your face, and you may want to throw some back in their face. And chances are, instead of sharing something that you wanted to share, you decide that, you know what, I don't even want to deal with this right now. I'm going back to my office or wherever I was. And you don't share the information that you wanted to share with them that you were so excited about. You were so needing to share what you were thinking about with them to try to get some feedback or to get some comfort. But again, they essentially hijacked the situation and dismissed what was important to you and decided to throw water in your face again. So think about that from the perspective of dismissive remarks. When someone is sharing something with us and we tell them that they're overreacting or that I already told you that, or it's not a big deal, we're essentially throwing water in their face, which is distracting or taking away from the value of what it is that they're trying to share or the information that they want to get from us. So we have to really be careful about that and take our time to think through the things that we're going to say or going to do before we do it, because there are always unintended consequences to our actions. And we have to be mindful of that when we're dealing with people, because we never know what someone's situation may have been before we encountered them. We don't know what's going on in their head. We don't know what they're dealing with in their hearts. So we have to be mindful. Now, here are just a few things that will happen over time as a result of those dismissive remarks, if that's the way we choose to behave ourselves. Because as effective and confident communicators, this is something that we make it a point not to do, that we try to make sure that we aren't doing this. And I will admit, I find myself at times, I will say some of these comments that I think back and I'll say, you know what, that I could have said that differently. And I'll go back to my wife and say, honey, you know what? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said it that way. I could have approached that a little differently, because we all make mistakes. And I'm comfortable in the fact that I believe I'm a confident and effective communicator, but I also know that I'm still human and I make mistakes. So I'm willing to go back and make the adjustments, to go back and correct the behaviors that I may have done that could have been perceived, even though it may not have been my intent to have been out of line. So I'm willing to take those steps. And that goes a long way when we're willing to try to acknowledge the mistakes that we make. So I'll do that. Honey, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said it that way, because I'll stop and think about it. I reflect on my interactions with people. And you definitely need to reflect on those interactions with your spouses if you're married, or your children, or the people that you care about, so that you don't damage the relationships. So when we get comfortable with dismissive remarks and it becomes a pattern of behavior, one of the first things that happens is you begin to invalidate the person that you're speaking to. They feel a lack of validation. And most of us, when we share our thoughts and feelings with people, we want them to validate us. We want them to validate what we're saying as true, as important, as relevant. And when someone makes a dismissive remark, it causes us to feel invalidated, or potentially even unimportant for some people, because again, you don't know where that person has come from, what life has looked like for them, if they have always had people tell them what they weren't able to do, or they've always had people tell them that what they say doesn't matter, that you just listen, you don't speak. So we have to be mindful of that. And if we put people in a position where they begin to feel invalidated, it can also cause those feelings of inadequacy for them to have, where they begin to experience low self-esteem. They may get into this state of emotional distress, which leads to feelings of anxiety, just anticipating the idea of having a conversation with you, because in their mind, they're thinking, okay, it's going to be another dismissive response. So why bother? And when they get to that point where they begin to feel that badly and anxious about conversating with you, it damages the relationship. And now they're wondering, why am I here? What's going on? And that can potentially lead to resentment in the relationship, because of the dismissive remarks that have a cumulative effect over time. It diminishes the trust. Why is someone going to come to you with their personal feelings, with their emotions, with their concerns, if every time that they come to you, or the majority of the time, because it doesn't have to be every time, just think about it. If you make someone feel bad once, chances are it's going to probably take 5 or 6 interactions before they feel comfortable enough that you aren't going to do it again anytime soon. So we have to be mindful. As they say, it takes 10 good actions to outweigh one bad action in business. The same can apply in our relationships when we're dealing with people. If you hurt someone's feelings one time, definitely twice, is you're going to have to put in some work to build that trust back. So those dismissive remarks will diminish the trust that people have in you. They won't feel comfortable enough to come to you with those exciting moments and thoughts, with those sensitive thoughts that they may have, because they don't want to get their feelings hurt again. It can also increase conflict. Dismissive remarks, they can increase conflict, because some people just decide that, you know what, I don't know what you meant, but this isn't the way we're going to be conversating. You are not going to speak to me that way. And they will let you have it. And you have to understand that with the people that you're dealing with, they become defensive or even aggressive in their response to feeling invalidated, or feeling as though you're dismissing them. And again, remember, that may not be your intent, but they don't necessarily know that. Because if you've ever read one of those documents that people post online, and they'll have the letters and the words in different places. They may have the first letter and the last letter in the correct place, but they'll mix up the letters in the middle. And our brains have a way of perceiving what the correct layout is supposed to be, and we're able to still read it. A lot of people can't. So understand that the perception of what we see we will see what we are perceiving based on our experiences, based on our emotions, and based on our level of understanding and ability to interact with people. So keep that in mind. Being dismissive to people can absolutely increase conflict because they may have been fed up. If they've gotten to the point of resentment with you, the hostility will definitely elevate and you will feel the hostility in return to what is perceived as a dismissive remark. Then at that point, you potentially run the risk of a loss of empathy in the relationship. When you lose the empathy in the relationship, you get to a place where no one really cares about the other person's feelings anymore. It's simply, this is what I want, this is how I feel. And when you become desensitized to what the other person is feeling, all hope is almost lost. It will take a lot of work to recover from a loss of empathy between people. And you don't want to get to that place. So be mindful of the dismissive remarks. We have to take the time to try to fix that. Stop people. Don't allow it to continue because that loss of empathy is going to be detrimental and very difficult to undo when you become desensitized to the other person's experiences, to each other's feelings when they have thoughts and ideas that they want to share. So be careful. And ultimately, the emotional distancing. When you think about the lack of validation, diminished trust, resentment and hostility, the increase of conflicts, and then the loss of empathy together, it's inevitable that you're going to be emotionally distanced from one another. And what tends to happen for a lot of people is you don't recognize the distance immediately. And over time, you begin to pay attention and realize that, wait a minute, they don't say as much to me as they used to. They don't ask me questions like they used to. They don't come tell me how their day went like they used to. And now the person who is constantly being dismissive, now they want to know, well, what's wrong? You haven't been saying much lately. Well, of course not, because you've been dismissive all this time. So why would they say anything? And you don't even realize, as the dismissive offender, won't even realize why it's happened. You don't understand how you got to that point that they're no longer saying anything to you. But it's the cumulative effect of the dismissive remarks that gets a person to a place that they just wear down and they eventually stop fighting. They stop caring. And that emotional distance, again, just like a loss of empathy, can be very difficult to overcome when you get to that point because you haven't taken the time to be more mindful of the impact of your words when we're speaking to people. It's very important. Now, if we happen to be the one that is expressing the dismissive remarks, here's a few things to think about to get out of that mindset. The first thing I want you to do, because we typically know when we're expressing those dismissive remarks, we know it. It's usually an emotional moment, and emotions can flare. And when those emotions flare, we tend to allow them to drive and dictate what's going on in our lives. For those that don't practice the idea of emotional intelligence and being mindful of what's going on in your life and in your situation. But one of the first things I want you to do is to ask yourself why. When you know that you've made a dismissive remark, when it's intentional, because there are times it isn't intentional, but you absolutely know when you were intentionally being dismissive to someone. So ask yourself why. Why was I dismissive in that moment? And you have to go back and reflect on some of the past interactions that you've had. What are some of the circumstances that may trigger you to give that type of response? Is it because the person never listened when you gave them an answer? If you gave an answer, they always did something different, or they always wanted to rebut something that you shared in response to what they said. Whatever it may be, maybe they remind you of something bad that happened in the past, and that's the way you're dealing with it. But you need to understand the why. Ask yourself, why did I respond that way? Because you know it was probably hurtful. And when you do it intentionally, it was intended to be hurtful and dismissive to blow someone off. The next thing I will ask you to do is to grow your patience. Grow your patience. We have to have the ability to take time with people. All of us need people to be patient with us. None of us are perfect, and we all make mistakes. We all need someone to listen to us at some point in time. And today may not be your day that you need someone to listen to you, but your day is coming. So grow your patience. Patience isn't something that just happens because you say you want to be more patient. Patience happens because you make a conscious effort that in the midst of situations where you know you want something to be happening faster, you know you want something to be moving along more smoothly, you're willing to take the step back and say, you know what? All right, I'm going to wait. I'm going to practice my patience and I'm going to let it happen the way that it's happening. Many times we don't have the ability to control the outcome or the timing of what's happening. And I have my wife was a great example of patience. And I remember years ago when we first got married, we met one another at the church. We went through the development classes together. We grew up together essentially in the church, as adults, that spiritual growth and development. We grew up together. And I was very involved in my church. And once we got married, there were things that I did. I had responsibilities. I was in charge of AV, and many times there would be people wanting to speak with me after church was over. And she would be ready to go. And we would find ourselves 30 minutes, an hour sometimes after church had ended. And there's still people that I'm conversating with. Sometimes it's about the business of the church. Sometimes it's just because we were connecting as individuals, brothers and sisters that cared about one another. And for a little while, she would get upset and I would see her come in and she'd stick her head around the corner. And you can always tell in someone's eyes what's going on in their mind. And you knew. She was like, honey, it's time to go. Can we please leave? And for a while, she did that. But what I learned over time and recognized was that she subtly made adjustments. And she got to a place where she no longer questioned me about the time that I was spending after church, still hanging out at the church, doing the things that I was doing. She decided to grow her patience. And as a result of that, that has just continued in other areas of her life. So when we think about these dismissive remarks that we might make with people, we have to put in the effort to grow our patience and give them room, give them time to share what they're trying to share, the thoughts that they're trying to express. Some people don't understand how to concisely express themselves, and we have to be willing to give them a little room to figure it out when we care enough to let them have those moments if we're trying to be helpful and be valuable for them in their lives. So grow your patience. It's very important to do that. And that will help you in so many other areas of your lives, not just in communication in your relationships. And I want you to manage your emotions. You have to learn to manage your emotions. If not, they will put you in dark places quite often and in a lot of situations where you're having to apologize when you could have simply just walked away and reflected with good memories of a situation. Many times it's our emotions that get us in trouble. The anger or the fear or whatever the emotion is, when we allow the emotions to dictate and rule our behaviors and our responses, we're going to find ourselves apologizing a lot more times than we'll be laughing and smiling with people that we care about. So we have to learn to manage your emotions. And my wife mentioned something to me. There's a lady on TikTok that does videos, and she at one point in time was in prison for a little while. And she said she learned that the three main reasons people are in prison, those three main reasons were mental illness. It was, what was the second one? Mental illness. I forgot the second one, but the third one was anger. It was anger. So anger is an emotion. And when people don't understand how to manage their emotion, that emotion of anger, we may say anything, we may do anything. And when anger is that emotion that rules you, you will find yourself in some very bad situations. So when it comes to getting past making these dismissive remarks, asking yourself why, growing your patience, and learning to manage your emotions are critical. But the most important one that I would say, well, one of the most important ones, is to choose consideration over convenience. Choose consideration over convenience. I say that because it's very convenient to lash out or to give a really quick dismissive remark to someone when you're either uncomfortable or you're ready to leave or you feel like you just don't want to deal with the situation in that moment. So we have to choose to be considerate enough to allow them to share what's on their heart. We never know how much of an impact them getting to express their feelings will have on their life. And I want you to remember, and I mentioned this last week, be mindful of the exponential impact of our interactions with people. The one statement you make to someone today could potentially affect a generation of people. Because if you break this one person and now they take on the characteristics and the mindset of being broken that you may have created in them, they now pass that along to their children. And then their children pass it along to their children. And then they also behave that way with their peers and their coworkers or people that they may date because they've decided that I'm going to hurt you before you hurt me because that's what someone else did to me in my life. And people will perpetuate behaviors potentially that we impose on them. So we have to be very careful. Choose consideration over convenience. Everything can't be convenient. It can't be about us all the time. And remember, we all have feelings that can be hurt, even you. So be mindful of that the next time you're going to respond to someone or share something with them and a dismissive remark seems like the convenient approach. Choose consideration over convenience.